because one of the things that I think Francis did, it wasn't an easy read because he only gave you, and much like the film is, you only get these little snippets of all these characters. You don't get an actual plot line that you could sit there and map out on a piece of paper and go, this happens and then this happens and this happens and it kind of, a lot of things are all sort of happening at once. And so he didn't want to make it too obvious what was happening so that you would keep the mystery going. But it was a hard read. It definitely, I had to read it every time I got the script. I had to read it twice and mark it up the second
Yeah.
time, kind of follow it and go, okay, he's cut this out now. Oh, he's moved this over here. Okay, we have a new character. Oh, we've cut a whole character. It was a real thing to follow. And
Spoke to Glenn a couple of months ago about Bram Stoker's Dracula, also directed by Francis Ford Coppola, which has become one of our most viewed conversations on our podcast. Didn't realize there was such a big fan base for Dracula, but
neither.
uh, I saw Megalopolis trailer when it came out, and then I tried to watch it at TIFF here. They didn't have any press screenings, and then I went to see it a couple of days ago, and it was an interesting experience because I'm still trying to digest it, and I still think
Absolutely.
I'm just being honest, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Hey, welcome to the club.
and I thought the second half was easy to grasp and get digest, maybe because you get used to it, but the first half wasn't. So, but aside from that, visually, performance-wise, just things that have never been done before. It was quite mesmerizing, sometimes hypnotic almost, to be embedded into that world that you have never seen before.
Nice.
That's what
That's a
was
nice
amazing.
compliment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
That's
Glenn,
what
what were you
Francis wanted to create his own world and have you go into it. And when I've told people to go see it, I say you just have to sit down and accept from the very beginning of the narration. Just go with it and don't look at New York as being New York or, anything else. Just go with what they're saying and follow that. And it will take you off onto a fable, which is what he calls it.
Yeah. When I came back from the movie, my wife asked me, "So how was it?" Right? And I said my words were it was interesting because it was a combination of the Roman Empire plus what's going on in the United States right now, plus Shakespeare, plus it was just, a combination of things done in a very creative way. So which brings me to talking to both of you guys about the editing because not that editing doesn't play a part in any other film, but I think in this film it played a huge part because just the way it was completely unconventional. So just talk to me about, the process of working on a film like this. Whoever wants to take the lead and then follow up after that.
Go ahead, Cam.
Well, I think if we perhaps start about just talking about the dailies and how
Sure.
we kind of, became familiar with the material and, Glen pop in whenever, but we had set up at this hotel that Francis had purchased an Old Days Inn, which is a whole other story, which we can kind of follow up with later. Um, but his team, Moss and Robbie built some, makeshift edit suites and a project every day in. Glenn and I, in the morning, they get the footage. Our wonderful assistants, Gretchen, primarily, and Dana, with the help of some other people, would get us going, and we'd watch the footage, and then Glenn and I would kind of talk over like a commentary as we watch the material come in and sort of dissect scenes and talk about things. And that's where we kind of got to know each other really in sort of our, impressions of the material and how we wanted to cut a scene because we both wanted to keep up with the material individually, but at the same time discuss it, obviously. So we wanted to be very familiar with Francis's shooting and all the takes. And at the end of each morning, he and I would sort of embark and go and cut the scene or scenes that we had that day. And sometimes we would discuss, okay, well, I think there's a path that we could take. There's, this path, or you could go uh, take another path, and we would just go off. And then at night, Francis would come back with Roman, his son, who was shooting a lot of second unit, and we'd watch the footage again, and we get this time now Francis's impression of the material, and that was always fascinating because sometimes you read it completely different from the director. And then that night or the next morning, we kind of go and take his notes and feedback and adjust stuff, and we kind of repeat that for the next 7 months.
And that was what was cool, was when I first asked Francis, I said, well, how do you want us to do this? He said, well, you guys just figure it out. And so we both looked at each other and said, yeah, we both want to cut everything so we know it. And so that exactly as Cam described it, that's what we sort of did. But it was really great because at night when he would watch it with you, he didn't have to say much to give you an idea of which way he was thinking you should go. But also it was really great for us to like have spent the whole day cutting it and then watching it a second time in dailies on a big screen, because then all of a sudden you'd say, oh shit, that's the piece I was looking for that would make my cut better. And so you would it was really great because then often you'd go back even the same night and just go for 15 minutes and go grab those 4 shots that you saw again in dailies the second time and went, yeah, these got to go in my cut, and that made it, it was really great. I enjoyed it. I haven't watched dailies with a director in, God, 10, 15 years, because now all they want to do is, they shoot, normally Francis did, because he had a single camera with a second camera, but not often did he really shoot anything more than 2 cameras. So these days, most directors shoot 3 or 4 cameras all the time, and all they want to do is go back into their hotel room, jump in their underwear and order dinner and watch dailies by themselves and race through everything because there's so much to look at. So we were able to look at everything with Francis for the most part, which was brilliant, very unusual these days.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's quite a luxury.
It was.
Yeah.
So you guys have been spoiled pretty much now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
I know.
mean, you always kind of go from one project to the next, and you hope to continue certain, you know, traditions or adjustments and bring them along. But that's one that might be hard to kind of carry on with. But
Right.
it felt sort of sacred, to sit there with Francis and watch his footage.
100%. You look at again, you look at Coppola, Francis Ford Coppola. He's been around for what, 54 years now. Since making movies, since he's been recognized as a director. I'm sure he did stuff before that. But you see The Godfather. You have these establishing shots, very kind of calm approach. Apocalypse Now, similar. Dracula was a little bit different, but still had that calmness to it. This film was very different because I just felt like I think it's a huge thing for someone at the age of 85, to be able to put together a film like this with keeping in mind the attention span of people nowadays, and how it kind of goes from scene to scene and shot to shot. I just thought that was one of the things that I really admired about the film, aside from this, whatever else was there, was the fact that he was able to figure out, and I do think in about 10, 15 years, this film will be appreciated. 100%. Maybe I will probably appreciate it more than I did the first time. But it's just a comment that I might wanted to make. But aside from that, was the cut that you guys did, was it very similar to the script, or was there a lot of modifications and changes? Because again, it's a very unconventional film. So I'm just trying to understand how that sort of took place between the script and the post-production.
Well, I'll just start to say that really when you first assemble a film, you're sort of, as an editor, sort of obligated to cut it all together in order the way that is in the script, just so the director can see what he shot. And I always say you always want to take a piece of every angle that he shot and somehow get it in there, even if it might be too many cuts in the end, because you want to be able to remember and see all the angles and kind of 3D the world that he was creating by different camera angles. So, the first time you cut it together, you're sort of obligated to put everything in, but immediately you want to start taking stuff out when you see it's not working or doesn't need to be there, but you sort of can't do that. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I think Cameron and I both said, we're better off if we both cut all the dailies, ourselves, so that we get a chance, one, to see it all, but also because if you only cut half the film and the other editors cut in the other half, you would have time to go back in and keep refining your cuts. But if that would start to mean you'd start losing stuff, you'd start getting rid of lines and, bad setups or whatever. And that can be a real mistake to a director when they walk in and go, what happened? Any comments, Cam?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And also because I'm sort of used to working with directors in recent years where they're screening material, maybe not every day, or like I should say cuts rather than material, but more on the weekends, and they're getting a sense of how the film's sort of coming together, and therefore you can kind of jump to the next process of like Glenn says, removing lines and jumping scenes. But in this situation, Francis didn't want to really see anything other than the material and watch it with us. So you kind of did have to live with certain things, but we were always constantly building all scenes and cuts of things just to have them on hand. So when he did want to get into, you know, developing more of the story, we were already a little bit ahead of him, I think. And, especially with the material that was more experimental and theatrical, for example, the Shakespeare scene, Francis should shot that more as, I wouldn't say a throwaway thing, but it was more of a warming up the day and Adam and him kind of getting loose. And it's something that invariably ended up in the movie as
Because they actually shot it in
the
two
movie
places.
started to ask for these things.
Yeah, because
Right.
they shot it in
Yeah.
two places. They shot it first on the in that scene where it is, but then they also shot it when he got up on the ledge and stopped time. There was also that whole
Yeah.
section. He did the same speech.
Yeah.
So that was kind of
Yeah.
interesting. Same thing, two places. But ultimately, what
Yeah.
we did, I thought this was cool too, was when Francis finally finished, we just sat down and rolled both. And Cam and I had talked a lot, but we hadn't watched each other's cuts, partially just to kind of keep yourself virgin and keeping in your own head and going the way you want to go. And it was really fun to sit down and give Francis two options on each scene, just like we'd play a scene and then play another one. And we made it so he didn't really know whose it was. I kept switching it up, saying, well, I'll play Cam's first and I'll play mine. Next time I might play mine, then Cam's. And so I don't think Francis really even understood. He knew there were two cuts. And he just sort of like, I like that one. Okay, I like that one. I like that one. We went through and built a new assembly out of our two cuts. And I think I would have thought, if I was a director, I would have thought that was great because you instantly see two different editors' takes on your scene. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah,
so
for
glad
sure.
I'm so glad you guys did that because I always talk about this that if five directors got a script and they were told to go make a movie, whether it was a short or a feature, how each of those would interpret it. And in a similar way, two editors interpreting a scene. And I think that is something that should become more common because it's for the greater good of the film, right? You're bringing different perspectives in. Not one is better or right or wrong than the other. It's just that someone will have a completely different approach to a scene versus somebody else. And they may both work together or they just one may work. So I think that's a
And
really cool
also,
exercise.
Francis would remember the other cut. He was, because he shot. I always say that like a director sits on the set and it's like, molasses to watch all the different setups happen and the takes happen over the course of a day. Editors just sort of see it in a a 1.5 hour blitz of watching dailies. And it's like, oh, wow, but they have really watched it slowly evolve. And so he would remember shots and go, oh, in that other cut, there was a blah, blah, blah. And let's put that in. So there was a lot of even going back into the different versions and going, oh yeah, let's clip out that bit and put it in now that we've also assembled them.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
pretty impressive for his 85-year-old director, like for him to remember that. That's really awesome.
I mean, Francis can run circles around a lot of people who are much
In
younger, I would
memory.
say. Yeah, like he is pretty fit in that respect.
Very sharp. Still very,
Yeah,
very sharp.
yeah.
Amazing.
That's awesome. So when you guys were okay, again, I'm not trying to put you guys on the spot. I'm just curious. You know, you're hired to edit this film, Francis Ford Coppola's film, big star cast, everything. And as an individual yourself, as an audience, you start putting it together as time passes by after dailies, and you have like a scene or a chapter or two chapters, and you start watching it. Did it ever occur to you guys, each of you separately, like, where is this going? Is this something that's going to be appreciated by audience? Anybody going to watch this? Just, as an audience member.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I remember reading the script, to be candid, and being somewhat baffled by it. Um, and even to the point where, you know, there was a long period of time in sort of the gestation period before the shoot, and Glenn had been getting scripts well before, like years and years and years. So he's been a part of this for much longer. But
Right.
working with Francis and sending him notes, because he would send the script out to a lot of people. But you'd spend a lot of time considering um where to, give him a note and where to kind of wait and see how things go. But obviously it's like a roadmap in a way. And at certain points in the process, it was like, I don't know how this is all going to come together, but I have faith in Francis and I have faith in the process. And so to get to the point of shooting the material, um, it was always an endeavor. And as we were building it, and because it took so many turns tonally, and I think when we got to shooting, the script was actually pretty locked in for, day to day, with the exception of, something that would come up on set or a location issue. But when we got the material, it was kind of like as scripted. But then, of course, I think it changed a ton in the edit.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the things that I think Francis did, it wasn't an easy read because he only gave you, and much like the film is, you only get these little snippets of all these characters. You don't get an actual plot line that you could sit there and map out on a piece of paper and go, this happens, and then this happens, and this happens. And it kind of, a lot of things are all sort of happening at once. And so he didn't want to make it too obvious what was happening so that you would keep the mystery going. But it was a hard read. It definitely, I've had to read it every time I got the script. I had to read it twice and mark it up the second
Yeah.
time, kind of follow it and go, okay, he's cut this out now. Oh, he's moved this over here. Okay, we have a new character. Oh, we've cut a whole character. It was a real thing to follow. And about a year before he got into pre-production, he called me up and said, hey, can you take the first 3 pages and just go to YouTube and set up this scene of this movie? Because every time I try to explain it to somebody, they don't get it. And I was like, oh, well, how do you do? And so I read the first 3 pages, and it had this stuff about the satellite, the Russian satellite, and it had stuff about the mayor and the black mayor that had just gotten elected, and it had stuff about the trash not being picked up in the city in debt, and it had all this stuff about Caesar having won the Nobel Prize and developed Megalon. And it was all kind of like almost like bullet points. It might have only been 2 pages, just bullet points of what was going on, and to set the scene. And I remember just like going to YouTube going, oh, fuck, how do I try to create Megalon? And I found it's actually the woman scientist that he had also been talking to I didn't realize it, but she had done stuff with silk, building silk kind of structures using, silkworms to create their own, you know, solid material or, stringy material and then wrapping it into shape. And she did these beautiful things in an art gallery that were like 15 feet high and they were still growing as there was the silkworms were still eating. So I grabbed that off of YouTube. I grabbed a guy that I didn't know it was going to be Adam at the time. I think that was before they got Adam. It was going to be somebody else, but I grabbed somebody that was getting a Nobel Prize and put that in and got some old satellite footage and just stuck this whole thing together. And he showed that for a long time to a lot of people, including a class that he sort of taught that summer, where they went through and did some readings through the script. And he told me later, because I showed that to everybody just to so I didn't have to keep explaining it. They could just watch this 3 minute, 4 minute thing that I created. It was really funny. So that was just an intro to how he was still kind of creating it and changing things around pretty close to the following spring, when he did start really locking it down, and then pulled one big character out and gave some of that character's attributes to Shia's character. And that actually really glued the film together, I think, when Shia took over being the banker that another character had been in the script. That really, I think, made it a much more cohesive. And again, what you were saying about the second half, because you know what's going on with Shia as well as Wow, you start to feel that it's closing in around Hamilton Crassus's character. And so you get to know, you feel like there's a plot developing. Whereas in the first half, there's sort of like four plots developing. And they all sort of come together, partially because of some changes he made in the script, which I thought were great in the spring.
Yeah, I think I was gonna say Shia's character and his performance were probably for me um the standout part of the entire film. Like he really carried, even though it was Adam Driver's film, um it was him who kind of just gave it a little bit of more, like you said, cohesive, I guess. But yeah, again, I mean, I have to watch it again. I'm gonna wait for it to come on
Hmm.
streaming or DVD and watch it again. But Cam, I've already spoken to Glenn about, how he got connected with Francis Ford Coppola. Tell me your story about coming onto this project and how it all sort of unfolded.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I had worked with Guillermo del Toro for a while, and Francis had seen Nightmare Alley, which he liked, and he knew he knew Guillermo from a sort of a production that never kind of happened, but the Count of Monte Cristo, and so there was some familiarity there, and I happened to be in Los Angeles, and yeah, I got that like call from the agent saying, you'll never guess who wants to meet you. Would have never guessed it would have been Francis. But I was exhilarated just even the thought of just to go meet the guy and talk to him. And, he's such iconic filmmaker and a master that just to have a cup of coffee and walk away would have been enough, let alone walk down this path of Megalopolis with everyone. So yeah, I met with him, and I thought I'd be there for an hour and it turned into 5. And we just got along, and he didn't even offer me the job. He just said, give me your cell phone. And I was like, okay, I guess that's a good sign. And then you texted me and emailed me asking about casting and whatnot. So it just sort of like naturally unfolded. And when he hired me, he's like, I work with many editors, and I said, okay, like I look forward to that. And yeah, and then Glenn and I met in Georgia, and we hit it off. And like Glenn's my brother on this journey for sure. So I feel very fortunate to have had this experience. That's kind of it.
No, that's really cool. It's 1 hour turned to 5 hour. And it's always about the personalities, right? Like if they click, the work is always has to be good too, but if the personalities don't match, then that doesn't mean anything. Um, Glenn,
Yeah.
was there a reason for two editors? Was that just Francis' vision, or what was the story behind that?
If you really look at all of Francis's movies, they all have multiple editors, and very few don't. There's a couple of Conversation. Walter, I think, is the only editor on that. There's a few that Barry Malkin did, but generally they have multiple editors because he likes to see other viewpoints and wants to see different ways stuff gets cut together. And it's a lot like, there's multiple script writers on any movie, even though one may get this credit. It's the same kind of thing. You just sort of need different perspectives to help push along, especially if you want to move it along a little faster than you might just
Mm,
do on your own with one editor. If you have another editor, you could kind of send them off on different, tasks or directions. Take this scene and try this. And when we first actually started cutting the movie with Francis, he gave us half the movie, put Cam on the first half, and I went to the second half. And so for a number of about 2 months, probably, we each just worked on one half of the movie, but we always screened it together and we'd always talk about it. But we screened it on a weekly basis. That I think was another kind of cool thing because I think it pushed the film along pretty fast when Francis first got into his quote director's cut. We screened it every Saturday night for wasn't it like 10 weeks or something, Cam? I think something like
Yep.
that.
Yep.
And that really pushed it along. I kept thinking at the end of every week, and Cam can talk about this too, but at the end of every week, you'd see a real progression of the film. You wouldn't just see, because sometimes you can just sort of just nibble at scenes and tighten them up and do stuff, but not really do things, not move a scene around or cut it in half or do something for a while. But Francis was right on it and ready to start. And it dropped minutes every time from one Saturday night screening to the next. It was dropping 5, 10 minutes at a time. And it was really great to see because you got heartened by the fact, because the first time you assembly is usually too long and because it has everything in it.
Yeah.
It was probably, I don't know, was it 3.5 hours or something? It wasn't
I think
crazy.
it's like I remember the first one being close to 4, and it was almost unwatchable,
Yeah,
but we
maybe
watched it.
Madison
But
Square
it
Garden was like
quickly, yeah,
25 minutes at that point.
yeah,
Everything.
it quickly dropped, like Glenn said, every week, and we would screen it. But Francis has a lot of what he calls apprentices, young kids that he hired in around Georgia and near Atlanta, and they would participate in the screening. But after Glenn and I would just kind of bounce and leave and let Francis sort of curate the discussion. But it was more helpful just to watch it with a group of people and then hit the week coming up with
that's
our
amazing.
own opinions of it. So
Yeah, and also because he would every Monday morning would have a whole slew of notes that he had gathered from watching it with these kids and making his own judgments. And so we always were like out of the gate on Monday morning. We never sat there and went, okay, what are we going to do today? It was like, whoa, here come the notes, start attacking.
yeah.
That's so cool. The reason I asked about the additional editor because normally with films the editor comes on board second one because the first one has to go or the film has gotten extended or whatever. But this is really cool. I didn't know that's the reason Francis has multiple editors. So that's really cool. You know, the director's cut you mentioned, how long was that? Just out of curiosity.
I mean,
20,
in a project like this, I think director's cut it was always evolving. So it's sort of like there was an assembly that, we had this sort of
Right.
quote unquote bake off of selecting scenes and which ones to use. But eventually, it's just a process for Francis because he hadn't seen cut scenes until he, stopped shooting. So it was just a matter of like, oh, this has got to go. This has got to like be dealt with. So,
Right.
um,
but I think
yeah,
it got down to
it
after
was
about
it was always a director's cut.
Yeah, because we didn't have a studio, which was what was so great. One of the things I've always thought and said to myself is, God, if you can work with directors that have final cut, you're so much better off than having to deal with studio notes, because studio notes can be good, but and they can help a director find there's footing if they're a little loose in some places, but generally it's the no vote at studios. It's like one studio person will say, I don't like this, I hate that, and then you start mashing a film and just sort of flattening it, and you don't get the valleys and peaks that is what makes a great director a great director. And so that was the great thing, is there was no studio to tell Francis he needs to shorten Madison Square Garden or whatever they might have said, which would have been
Right.
wrong.
Yeah.
Right, which makes the
When
film so singular and yeah,
sorry, go on,
you
Cam.
know. I was just gonna say that which makes the film so singular and unique. And you're watching this film and Caesar has a lot of qualities that are like Francis's, and there's this I think there's a lot of biography in the film, and I think you're at times really walking through this director's brain while you're watching the film, and you're having this watching this conversation go on between the audience and him. And not to say like it's some swan song piece or he's saying goodbye, but there's a lot of homage to other films in the picture, which might not be totally evident, but and there's also just lots of personal things that he's working through and as an artist, which makes it beautiful because he took a massive, bold leap and a lot of risks to make this film that you would be up against, like Glenn was saying, in a studio system. So it clearly makes it a unique project and unique film in
Absolutely.
that respect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. Glenn, you and I talked about this, that how, um, when the screen Dracula, like, you guys went through the process and everything, and he's like, you got studio notes, and it was like a fiasco for him, what was not working, what was working. Um, and then I saw his interview with somebody, I don't know who it was recently. It was about Megalopolis, but he talked about The Godfather too, that how when he first did a screening in San Francisco, how people didn't like it because he couldn't figure it out. Then he went underneath his bed for like a couple of hours and it hit him that the time periods between the past and the present were too short. They were 10 minutes each. So when he extended that to almost 20 minutes, it just worked. With this film, was there any moment like that? Like, oh, it didn't work, something is not working out, or how is this going to happen, or how we're going to deal with it, even though there was no studio involved, just on that level.
One thing that Cam and I had also done, the one thing Francis did want to see was kind of like, a reel of just, a fun reel to show people what the film was kind of looking like. And we created this thing that was about 10 minutes long. And the first thing we put in there was Caesar walking off the edge and stopping time. And I
Mm,
think one of the first big breakthroughs was after Francis, and he'd watched this, promo reel that we did. He probably watched it 100 times with, 50 different people. And about, I don't know, was it 3 or 4 weeks into editing when he said, what we got to do? We got to take that scene was originally like scene 17, I think, in the script. It happened after the buildings had actually fallen down, in which Julius sees Caesar stop time. And one of the first big things that Francis did that was really great, that just changed the caliber, was to take that scene of him walking off the ledge or walking up to the ledge and putting it in the beginning of the movie. It changed every time. I can remember when we watched it that way, it was just like, oh yeah, this sets up the
Mhm.
movie he's making, telling you right off the bat, we're going to stop time. We're going to have some wild stuff happen in this movie. Didn't you think, Cam, isn't that one of the first things that was really a great change?
Yeah, I recall working with him on a weekend, and he said all my movies have these memorable openings, and this movie right now in its current state, it was working as far as like a documentary style, newsy kind of thing, but he's like, I want there to be a punch. I want there to be like this show-stopping moment. And we kind of just scrolled down the timeline and he was like, well, there you go. Like that doesn't get bigger than that. I mean,
Yeah.
But I
the
think it was
conceit
because he
of
kept seeing our
time.
promo. I think it was because he kept seeing the promo reel, and
Yeah, oh,
that's how
yeah,
he
I think
thought of
so
the
for sure.
promo.
Because he also mentioned how it distilled like all the exciting moments, and he's like, I wish the film could just be as exciting as the promo.
He did say that, yeah.
Um, but to answer another part of your question about like at what point did the movie click a bit more, I think we got to a point where we dropped some big scenes that were, they worked obviously on their own, but in terms of the not even the rhythm, but just getting to sort of the meat and potatoes of the film, and explaining things that kind of even didn't go anywhere in the end of the film, like Megalon in sort of the application, where I think Francis and the same could be said about time stopping, but these are sort of like these metaphors of things rather than being something where, again, like a traditional studio note might have been, you need to flesh out what Megalon is, you need to flesh out the city those are the things that are sort of untraditional to this film that Francis didn't give a shit about. Like, time, and he explains it very elegantly in the film with Julia and Caesar on the scaffolding when she says, architects freeze it, musicians rhythmatize it. Time to him is something that is something an artist plays with and as editors as well. So I think the conceit of opening the film with that is something that was very interesting. And I think once we kind of cleared the path of the film to get rid of this extraneous sort of plotting that might have been more typical, it sort of opened up the film to kind of breathe. And yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, the opening sequence, I remember when the first trailer came out, it started off with that sequence, and even when I saw it in the movie theater, the most amazing thing about that opening sequence, even if that was the film, like that opening sequence would stand alone as a short. And the way you guys did in the script, in the post, in this, in the direction, the cinematography, it doesn't look like I never felt, oh my God, that is such a cool effect. It was never like that. It was more like this scene is an amazing scene from the standpoint of the character that is in the film. And that does hook you on. I said like the first half was interesting, the second half was easier, but I think the opening itself, like I said, is a very powerful opening. And I really enjoyed it.
Right. Yeah, I do too.
Um, what was it like when it premiered at cons? Were you guys there at cons?
Yeah.
So the reaction that the audience gave, and then the critics gave, and then the buzz and the word of mouth, and then it came at TIFF a similar way.
Yeah.
What was that like experiencing on something that you worked and nobody, it's not that it's a bad movie, but people have their opinions. So how do you deal with something like that on a film like this?
I read quite a few of the reviews after Cannes, and I always say when I look at movies I've worked on, I can agree with almost every review, whether it's good or bad. Some of the bad ones have good points. They say stuff that doesn't work or they don't think it was good. But that's what's great about film. There's a democracy in film, and not everybody has to vote for it. And it's a play. This movie is for the people that want to endeavor in it, or want to go with Francis on his journey, and it's not for everybody else. So it was interesting to read all the reviews, and I didn't disagree with people that said, "Oh, it was incoherent or it didn't make sense or what is Megalon? I don't even get it." I went, "Yeah, you probably could say that if you weren't going with the film. But if you do go with it, like I sort of said in the beginning, and follow the narration and follow, kind of where it is, what they are saying, it does come to a resolution that works for Francis and works for me. I enjoy the end of the film when they do start talking about the future and man, and I find that to be, not many people, not many films will stand up and make declarative statements about the future of humanity, which I thought was cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, there's critics that I respect and love and admire and always will race to see what they have to say about a film. So it's sort of exciting to see what they had to say about this film in particular. And like you say, Glenn, I can agree with all sides. And at the end of the day, though, I feel like, there's a certain cynicism that can creep into critics and now analyzing pictures, but Francis is quite earnest and clean in sort of the messaging of the film. And I think that's the most beautiful thing. So to take away from that, to me, you kind of miss the point of the movie in a way. So
Yeah.
Yeah, he
Well,
wasn't
one
trying to fake you out, which is what some directors do, and a cheap action scene doesn't work or something. He was never trying to fake you. He was giving you his earnest decisions of what he wanted the film to be and was willing to go to great lengths to get it. With, spending all that money that he spent, doing everything that he did to get what he wanted. It's what he wanted. And
yeah.
so I think, hats off. There aren't many directors that can really say in a film, this is what my film, this is the film I wanted to make 100%. Usually it might be 75% or whatever.
Right. There wasn't a lot of compromise.
So,
Well, that's good. Yeah, the thing with critics is like everything, whether it's audience critics or professional critics, everything is subjective, right? Like you will have a film nowadays. There's a lot of people's political views that sort of go into your criticism of a film, like not necessarily about the film, but about the ideology and all that. I mean, one of the most recent examples, it doesn't matter which side of the politics you're on. The new movie with Dennis Quaid, who plays Ronald Reagan
no,
on
right.
Rotten Tomatoes, I think it's like under 10% by critics, and the audience is like 90 plus positive. And it's just, it just goes to show that sometimes people, for whatever reason, bring in their politics knowingly or unknowingly too, which I think for a film is not a good thing because a film is a piece of art. You're telling a story. You got to put those things aside and appreciate the art and the cinema that you're watching. Or if you don't like it, that's fine. But I'm just kind of speaking in the broader, terms that how critics bring in all their own politics. And that's why when I read Megalopolis, I didn't even bother, getting that influenced by them. I'm like, I still have to go see it. And everybody's like, are you crazy? You're gonna waste money and time to go watch it. I'm like, I don't care. I'm going to see it. It's Francis Ford Coppola's movie. I have to go watch it.
I
And
mean,
he's
at
not,
the heart of,
no, go
sorry,
ahead.
it's just at the heart of every review, that's basically it. Like, you just have to go see it.
Yeah.
And that's what he wanted. He wanted people to go see it and make their own opinion because he's not a very overtly political person. He doesn't talk about politics. I've known him for years and years and years. Um, I remember one time when I was working on Ellie Coppola's film, I think I can't remember. She had to go off to a Nancy Pelosi fundraiser because Nancy lives in the Napa Valley right there, and they've known him for years and stuff. And he was trying to convince her not to go because he had somebody coming, an actor coming in for dinner, and he always likes to have Ellie be the person that kind of smooths over the silent gaps that might have happened in a dinner
Right.
party scene. And but I almost had never heard him talk about politics at all. Although no, I know he's left leaning, and we know that's obvious, but it's not like he talks about it or it's a huge thing. But it was part of the world that he was creating in this movie that goes back to his childhood. There's a lot of things in different decades. So the Black Mayor is Roger Dinkins. And the Robert Moses is the architect from the 50s who took down the whole building tenement to create the Lincoln Center, and everybody was up in arms about displacing people. And so he took all these different decades that he was a real New Yorker in and kind of was piecing them together against the backdrop of also what he was reading in the Roman journals of various people that he was interested in. So, so it's political, but more in a his own growing up in that world, as opposed to now coming down and going, is it Trump or, Kamala, who's, it's not like, it wasn't like he ever talked about that, or Biden. I never heard him mention anything. So
Yeah,
it's
no,
a
this
personal
yeah,
political mythology.
definitely. There are scenes in there which somebody might interpret, well, this was supposed to be, and that's fine. But as a whole, it doesn't have that element that I felt because I didn't feel anything political in the film, even though there were certain elements here and there. It was just more about power, greed, and deception and finding acceptance and all that stuff, which are universal themes, which we all relate to.
True.
Amazing. Anything you guys want to add before we wrap up? This has been
I'd work with
amazing.
Cam anytime, anywhere, any place. We time together.
Likewise. No, it
It's
was
good
really
actually having
special.
two editors is good. I actually, when I've worked on movies because I've come in as a fix-it editor on movies, I've started movies, I've been fired off of movies. Every editor has. You're not an editor until you've been fired at least once. Uh, I've often thought it is surprising that more directors don't have multiple editors. I think a lot of them are control freaks, and they feel if they have two editors or three editors, they'll lose control. But if they just have one and beat down on that one, they'll get what they want. But I like Francis for that. Worked on Dracula, had a couple of editors, and Godfather 3, I got to work with, Barry Malkin and Walter Murch and Lisa Fruckman. And it was really great to see these editors that had, either won Academy Awards by then or were nominated. And they all had their in own way of kind of working. And a lot of editors actually, it depends again how you come into editing, but if you come in the side door and you were never really an assistant, you never really knew how anybody else did it. And you just make your own style up. And then you get good at that style, and hopefully you have a career with that style. But it was very interesting when I did work with other editors to see other people's styles. And I did get something from just about everybody that I ever worked with, some little nugget of like, oh yeah, I should think of it like that. Oh yeah, maybe I should do that. Walter Murch had some very interesting approaches because when I worked with him on Godfather 3, he actually was the only one cutting on film. That film was totally edited digitally, except for Walter when he came in kind of late into the whole movie making process. And he wanted to work on film, but it was really interesting watching he would sit there, and I'll just give you a quick thing. He was going to recut the opening of the movie, which is the big party scene. And I had recut it with Francis, and it was 27 minutes long when I started working on it with Francis from the first editor who cut it. And then I got it down with Francis to like a 17-minute tight version that he wanted. And then he said, well, let's give it to Walter and see what Walter does. So Walter recombined, because it was also a work print cut. We were cutting digitally, but we followed with a work print. He had the work print all put back into its original reel so he could watch dailies all in, in the course of a couple of days. But anyway, it was really interesting because when I started cutting with Francis, I just dove right in. And as soon as Francis said, let's start with this part of the party, I would immediately pull out dailies and just start grabbing stuff and throwing stuff together. And Walter didn't. I kept asking his assistant, what's he doing in there? He goes, oh, he's still watching dailies. For days, he was like watching dailies and he was making notes, copious notes. And I learned from him that, and then in the last 2 days of a week, he cut a whole 27-minute version of it back together. And I was so amazed that in 2 days he did it. And I realized his style was totally different than my style, because back in the film days, you couldn't just keep cutting your work print. You'd turn into shreds if you keep making recuts and cuts and cuts and cuts. So he really thought it out before he made any cuts. And I was a kind of a jump in and just start throwing stuff around kind of guy, getting into the closet and grabbing stuff. And it was just two different styles. And I tried to learn from his style that no, when you watch dailies, you should really come at it with an attack plan based on thinking about it and not just throwing stuff into the air and seeing what hits the ground. It was interesting.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all that valuable information. Cam, do you have anything to add, man?
I felt like that was a great story. Just end it
I
there.
know, I know. I was mesmerized by it for sure.
No, I mean, just because, like I say, it was the first time I ever collaborated with another editor that it was like a brother in the trenches. So, I mean, there was so many moments where Glenn and I would be just talking, like, Walter thinking and watching the footage. So we did that, but we just did it together. And I
Yeah.
think that was invaluable because those conversations never left my mind throughout the whole process. So it was always like, oh, what Glenn just said there, that I didn't think of that, or because we had this conversation, it led to this idea. And to kind of deal and wield with Francis as a material and be his intellect and see his like just this multi-pronged monster of a film with, there was moments where the kitchen sink is sitting in the movie. So how do you kind of call that stuff out yet still honor the material and honor Francis, who's trying to make, you know, this this passion project. So I guess, I mean, every movie is a passion project, but like at this point in his career, I think it's quite a movie to take on. So I think, and just collaborating with everyone on our team, we were so fortunate to have the crew that we had because, we were all living down there in Georgia for quite a long time. So, that's a different challenge altogether, but we got through it and had a wonderful experience.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I
So,
loved it.
That's super
yeah.
cool. No, thanks guys so much for working on this film. Again, like I said, I'm definitely gonna rewatch it maybe a couple of times when it comes on VOD or even DVD. I'll probably buy a DVD and re-experience it and just it's like I was just talking to somebody just before this podcast. Mark Andrews, he's like one of the storyboard artists on Iron Giant, which tanked at the time, and now it's like a cult classic. I was telling him the story when Spielberg's AI, which was written by Kubrick, came out. I remember so into the film until, Haley Joel Osment's character go underneath the water and the camera pans out, and I'm like, oh my God, this movie is gonna end. This is so amazing. And then there's a whole last act, and I didn't get it for another couple of years and until I saw the film two, three, four, five times. And I think similar is going to be with this film. You just have to sort of live in that world several times to be able to understand not only but appreciate what an amazing film this will be in the future. And I think it is. It's just about grasping it. So thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for your time and sharing all this valuable information.
Well, cheers.
Thank you.